Welcome to AI Goes to College, the podcast that helps higher education professionals navigate the changes brought on by generative AI. I'm Dr. Craig Van Slyke, and I host the podcast along with friend, colleague, and co-host Dr. Robert E. Crossler. Combined, Rob and I have over 40 years of experience in higher education, serving in roles ranging from adjunct faculty to dean. We're here to help you figure out what in the world's going on with generative AI and, more importantly, what you can do about it. Welcome to another episode of AI Goes to College, where we try to help you figure out what you ought to be doing about the effects of generative AI on higher ed. Rob, we've got a number of things to talk about today, starting with a really interesting story about how somebody used generative AI to help out with sort of a challenging task. So feel free to obfuscate, I love that word, obfuscate any of the details. But I thought it was pretty interesting, and I think a lot of our listeners will find it interesting and useful as well, because we all have to engage in these sorts of activities. How's that
Perfect.
for
Thanks,
foreshadowing?
Greg.
All right.
So a story I'm going to tell is about my 20-year-old son, and he is entering his junior year of college. So very much the audience that we talk about with AI Goes to College. And this summer, he needed to write a difficult email, several paragraphs long, telling a story. And he sat down, and the first iteration he worked with his mom on and kept it in his voice, and it had all the facts. The story was there, but as I'm reading it, trying to give him guidance, it just needed improvement. The stuff was there, but it could have been written better. And when you're sending something off to an external person dealing with these difficult situations, I think it's really important to get the message written well. And so instead of spending time editing it, working with him on how to make this letter better, I suggested that generative AI technologies work really well for taking what you've written and making it sound better. But instead of just saying, here, go use this one, I said, well, there's ChatGPT, which you're familiar with. You've done a few things playing with ChatGPT. You can feed it the letter and tell it that you are a college student who is writing a letter asking for an outcome that you desire, so kind of prime the prompts. But I also encouraged him to do the same exact thing with Claude 3.5 and then to compare the results. And so he goes off, and literally 5 minutes later comes back and he's like, Dad, they're both really good, but they're different. And I said, great. Go through them, decide what voice, what narrative you want to say, and pick those from different places that are good and that are not good. And ultimately, he presented me something and had me read through it to show me what he had completed. And outside of about 2 word choices, which he had gone through and fixed words that he didn't like that it used, words that he would never use in writing.
Like nonetheless.
Like nonetheless.
Delve, all those classics.
Yeah. And so, edited just a couple of words, and I was like, man, that's good. It took out a lot of the repetitiveness. Sometimes when you write from just train of consciousness, you babble on a bit in what you write. And it really cleaned all that up in a way that it was a tight letter that if all my communications from students were written like that, it would be a whole lot easier to discern what it was they were asking for, what they were needing. And I thought it did a great job of improving his writing. And he was like, holy cow, Dad, this is going to be so much better than going to the English tutorial labs when I have papers to write and to get some editing done to take my stories, to take my prose and make it better.
So I want to point out to all of you listeners, if you were rolling your eyes, he was not grade grubbing. We're not going to get into the details, but he was not whining about his grade or anything like that. It had nothing to do with that sort of thing. I also want to point out that this was not just a difficult letter to write. It was personally very important to him. So the outcome was a big deal for him, or will be a big deal. I guess it's still off in the future. But Rob, this is a great example of what we've been calling human AI co-production. So if he had just slapped a prompt in, write me this letter, copied, pasted, it wouldn't have been that great. Or if he just wrote it himself, it would have been okay, but not that great. But by working with AI, it turned out something better that is going to be easier for the recipient to go through and understand, makes him feel better because he expressed himself well. There's the instrumental value of it being a more effective letter, but it's also kind of emotional, affective, where he feels better about it too. He's going to know that he gave it his best shot, whatever the outcome is. So I think that's really important and something that we need to take on a couple of different levels. So for those of us who are faculty, this is something we can help our students understand. On the last episode, we talked about helping students take the long view of their learning. We can also help students understand how to work in concert with AI, how to work together, that idea of co-production. But then as faculty, we've got the same sort of thing going on. We have to write these kinds of letters. I mean, anybody that writes letters of recommendation, every once in a while you get that one, like, it's going to be a tough one to write. Rob, you're a department chair. I've been a department chair and a dean. Those evaluation letters, maybe there's some work to be done here. It can really help us craft those things in a more effective way. So anybody that's in an administrative position, staff position, academic administration, the same kind of an attitude, I'm really talking about a mindset, a co-production mindset, could be useful. Does that all make sense?
Absolutely. And one thing I wanted to add is the version of these tools that my son used was the free version. And the free version did a great job. And the conversation we had around it was, if you would have just asked these tools to write it for you, it would have become obvious that you did not write it. And I know personally, when I read something that I'm pretty certain was written not by the individual, but crafted by AI, my response to it is different. So when you see that the person's voice, the person's story that they put something behind shows up, I think that becomes evidence that then they took the time to make sure the grammar and the writing around it was all really good and tight as well, as opposed to just have generative AI write it for me. People read that and say, are you really serious? Do you care enough to actually have this conversation? And so being cognizant of, does this sound like the tool did all the work for me, or does this sound like I took the time to utilize resources that can help me have my voice shine through?
Yeah. Yeah. And I think we need to let students know that, at least in my mind, is a pretty appropriate use of AI. As you were talking about that, it occurred to me, two things occurred to me. Number one, the free versions are the ones that blew us away, are actually better than the ones that blew us away a couple of years ago. We tend to think we need the latest and greatest, but GPT 3.5 and Claude, whatever, Claude 2, I don't remember what their free version is called, they're still pretty good. So you don't
and
have to
Claude
pay a lot.
3.5, Craig, is free. You just can't give it as many prompts as if you
Right.
paid for it. So, I mean, it's amazing what they're doing to make this available to everyone. A bit of an
Yeah.
arms race, I think, because if someone else is free and you're charging for it and they're comparable, you're probably not going to get people to pay for yours when they can have the other one for free. So
Right.
it'd be interesting to see how that all plays out.
Yeah, right. I'd forgotten that, but you're absolutely right. It is free for a limited number of prompts, but I think that limit is not tiny. For something like, this use case, it would have been fine. Maybe a more important point gets back to the idea of, to use a fancy word, democratization of not really technology, but of that kind of assistance. I'm a first gen college student. Neither one of my parents went to college. Actually, my mom did. We got our college scholarship after she retired, so she went for a little while. But the time I was in college, neither of my parents had gone. And there are a lot of people in that boat. They don't have the ability to just turn to somebody and say, hey, Dad. I mean, your son's got a college professor for a father who can advise him on these kinds of things, especially, certain types of letters. But not everybody has that. And so if we discourage students from using these tools appropriately, we're going to remove a tool that can really help some of these less advantaged students. So what do you think?
Absolutely. I think that, when I think about what generative AI and ChatGPT can do, is it can raise the floor equally across the board and really bring up everyone to the same, at least basic level of a starting point when used appropriately and when used properly. And I'm excited about that. I think it's going to be great for students that don't come from a background of educated parents or natural giftedness or whatever the things are that might put someone ahead of another person in how they achieve academically. So I hope that everyone sees this as a great tool for helping equalize the playing field at some level.
Well, it could be a boon for less well-resourced universities as well. I mean, you're at a big state school. I'm in a decent-sized state school, but there are a lot of schools. I mean, just about everybody's got resource constraints now. But some smaller schools, you mentioned going down to the English lab. Well, they probably have one, but those poor folks are probably massively overworked. And so they'll get to your letter in a week or two or whatever it is. And this is more immediate. You've got 24/7 access to a tool that may not give you feedback that's quite as good as the people in the labs, but it might also be better. So, but you have access, 24/7 access, which is a huge deal. So I really want to make sure that before we move on to the next topic, that we get our main point out there. What made this so interesting was that your son used AI to help him make his work better, not to do the work for him, not to substitute for his effort, but as a guide to help him do a better job. And I think that's the mindset we all need to have, and that's the mindset we need to put into our students' heads as well.
100%.
All right. So, is ChatGPT bullshit?
Did you just swear, Craig?
I did. There was a paper in Ethics and Information Technology, which is a decent journal, called ChatGPT is bullshit. And there's a link in the show notes, and it's available for free. There's not a paywall. It was written by Michael Townsend Hicks, James Humphreys, and Joe Slater of the University of Glasgow, which, for those of you who aren't familiar with it, that is a huge, big-time school. I mean, I'm trying to remember, was it David Hume? I mean, some of those people that you go way back, that's where they taught or that's where they went to school. So it's a really good school. And they claim that the falsehoods produced by large language models like ChatGPT, are best characterized as bullshit rather than the more commonly used term hallucination. And they tie this back to a book that came out a number of years ago, and I'm trying to see if I can find it, written by a guy by the name of Harry Frankfurt about bullshit. And I'll put a link to that book in as well. And he defined bullshit as reckless disregard for the truth. What Hicks and colleagues are arguing is that large language models have no notion of the truth, therefore they're indifferent to truth and thus are bullshit. And that's a gross oversimplification, but that's the gist of their argument. Before getting into what I think, what do you think, Rob?
That's a great question. And the first thing that came to my mind when I read this is, what is truth? Which could take us down a whole nother path that I'm not sure we need to go down. But I think it's worth mentioning because the whole idea that there is an absolute truth and that a technology will get it right, to me, I'm not sure that's the world we live in right now, that there is an absolute truth. And therefore, if anything is not truth, it's bullshit, is somehow doesn't sit well with me. And so the place I ended up, and you're probably going there, is the importance of knowing enough about what you're using these tools for to be confident that it's right.
Yeah, this is a little bit of an esoteric argument. So the more technically correct term is confabulation, which is a memory gap where we think we remember something, but we really don't. It didn't really happen. And we all have those. I'm not an expert in the real details of confabulation, but like you remember something from your childhood that didn't really happen. So you're not lying because you're not intentionally trying to deceive. And so these tools are not lying to us. They just don't quite remember the truth. The reason I really don't like the term bullshit is that, Rob, you've probably known a fair number of bullshitters in your time. And if we sat down over a beer, we could probably come up with a number that we mutually know. And they're always, in my experience, somebody who's a bullshitter has some ulterior motive. They're trying to aggrandize themselves. They're trying to enhance their reputation, their whatever it might be. They've got some motive. They've got some intention. And that's what's missing in this article, the way they conceptualize bullshit. And what they do is they, in a very convenient twist on Frankfurt's ideas, they kind of say, well, what we're talking about is not hard bullshit where there's an intention, but rather is soft bullshit. And it's like, okay, this is where we start to part ways, and where I think they're going a little bit too far.
Well, and Craig, I think, the reason why you go too far is because that's what gets papers published. It's a strong story. But the notion that there's bias in what has been used to train these models, that there is a desire, if you will, if we're going to add humanality to generative AI, a desire to give you an answer, and maybe an answer that you would like. And I think as users of these technologies, we do need to understand and appreciate some of the aspects of this technology that are going to show up in what it produces for us. And so a strong word gets attention, but in reality, what I pick up on is it is so crucially important to know what it is that you're working with, or you're going to make yourself look the fool.
Yeah, yeah. And I think that's absolutely the value in this article. It got a lot of attention. I mean, I wish I'd have written it. I wouldn't have written it the same way, but, they did get a lot of attention. Even though I think they're wrong, they are bringing to light the idea that you just mentioned. One of the things that I think they did get right is that these large language models are designed to produce something. Like a kid that wants to please, they might just make something up. So I think that part is something that we want to keep in mind, that it's going to try to produce output. I mean, unless you're going outside guardrails or that sort of thing, it will often, not 100% of the time, but it will typically try to produce some output, even though that output may be false. And so you absolutely have to fact check these things. I also thought it was really interesting around the whole idea of anthropomorphism. And you mentioned the human-like tendencies. One of the things I didn't like about this article is that they criticize confabulation and hallucination as being anthropomorphic, like bullshit isn't. But that's all kind of our academic take on things. I do think at the end of the day, the good news about this article is that it draws attention to the limitations of large language models. And it drives home, and I know I'm repeating what you said, it drives home the fact that if it's important, you better double check it. And so that's true of any of these models. I mean, some models are more prone to confabulation than others, but they're all subject to it at some point. And then I want to back up and make one other kind of small point. Even though I don't think ChatGPT is bullshit, it can absolutely be used to churn out bullshit. So they called it a bullshit machine. And so I think we need to keep that in mind too, because we're going to see more and more bullshit produced by generative AI.
Yeah, and I think that becomes an important filter as receivers of information, and this is a different direction for a different conversation, but the whole misinformation, disinformation, fake news era stuff that we dealt with over the last, I don't know, 4 years, the last election cycle really put a highlight on some of that stuff. It becomes so much easier if you do want to deceive to use these tools to do a really good job of it. And so, what level of skepticism does that force us as consumers of information to look at and consider when we're reading some of these things?
Yeah, absolutely. And it's being used for phishing attacks and all kinds of things in cybersecurity. And it's like any technology, it can be used for good, it can be used for evil. That's where we are. So, I think my conclusion is ChatGPT isn't bullshit, but that doesn't mean that it's not going to make stuff up. All right, now let's talk about policy, everybody's favorite topic. But if your university, department, college does not yet have a policy around AI, they will. And my guess is that virtually every university either has one by now, or they'll be rolling one out in the fall, or they've got a committee that's trying to put one together. So I wanted to talk about that a little bit. And this could get in the weeds, but I think there's some important things here. So let's start off with talking about, why do you need an AI policy? So Rob, what do you think?
I think it's important. If you don't have some policy, what you're going to end up with is a piecemeal approach where every faculty member, every person you talk to says something different about how things should be done. And when you do that, you create an environment for students to where they are so lost and so confused that they don't even know what is allowable and what is acceptable. So having some guidance through policies creates an environment that is so much better for our students to know what is the world they live in now, especially as we're in this era of upheaval from the known.
Yeah, and I want to point out that even though we tend to focus on the academic side, the statement you made about students, you can make the exact same statement about university employees. They need to know where the guardrails are, just as much as the students do. Because, I know for a fact that a lot of university administrative positions are using generative AI heavily for communications and all kinds of other tasks. And so one of the things that I wanted to point out is that your university probably doesn't need a policy. It needs a set of policies. Some for the academic side, some for the administrative side. You need some around faculty use. And I think one of the big reasons, just what you said, it's confusion about what's okay and what's not okay. And you end up, as we've talked about in the past, the worst of all worlds, where the ethical people are afraid to use it, and the ones who aren't so concerned about ethics just use it without any concern to whether or not it's proper. There's also a risk management factor to all of this. Maybe not so much on the classroom use, but if you're putting information that should be private out, or if communications aren't getting properly vetted, that sort of thing, there's a very real risk to all of that. I don't know. Do you guys have to undergo the mandatory annual training?
Yes, I just got a reminder about it's due for me in January, but they sent me a reminder last week, so I've got 6 months to put it off. But yes, we get to do those.
Wait, yeah, put it off just long enough to screw up your Christmas break. Yeah, at least every state university, and probably every university, has this, and it gets irritating, but it's risk management. So, I don't think they really expect us to pay close attention, but the insurance companies, they're not self-insured. All the risk management folks can say, well, every employee undergoes this training. I don't need to be reminded not to use a rolling office chair as a ladder, but maybe somebody does. And so even though this is a little bit of a danger for those of us who are really into AI, it's obvious to us that you shouldn't put student data in. It may not be obvious for others, for people that aren't as familiar. So even though, if you're a chemist you probably know not to mix chlorine and muriatic acid. But if you're not, you maybe need a warning. It's pool maintenance time of the year, so I'm thinking about those kinds of chemicals. And so I think institutions need to have really good, solid policies around AI, just like they do around security, just like they do around workplace safety, harassment, all those kinds of things. But it's hard to do the risk management without having a sound policy, which is one of the points I want to make.
Yeah, I agree. And the place, too, where this comes in, and you alluded to this, student data is something protected by FERPA. And I know at our institution, our attorneys are very much looking at what are the different tools doing when we share the data and what's allowable and what's not. One of the conversations we've had is around generative AI detectors. And right now, we've got a blanket policy just says don't use them because no one's been able to assure to a level that our attorneys are happy with that it's not going to be a FERPA violation. So there's a lot of conversations. And interestingly, even some of the companies that say we don't store your data, we don't do anything with your data, it turns out people are demonstrating that maybe they do. So it is a bit of a wild, wild west of how organizations are providing generative AI technologies, and then what are they doing with that in the background from a training perspective or a storage perspective?
Well, and you hit on a really important point. I mean, it's one thing if a faculty member or a staff member starts using their personal ChatGPT account to do stuff. I mean, that could be bad enough. But if the university provides the tool and doesn't provide the policy and doesn't provide the training, that's a whole different level of risk that the universities expose themselves to. I want to go back. Well, let me back up just a half a step. And it's not just FERPA, but a lot of universities have health information, they have health centers, that sort of thing. And then it falls under, in the U.S., it falls under HIPAA, but you've got GDPR, you've got all kinds of regulations around the world that could be violated inadvertently with improper use of generative AI.
Well, another one too, Craig, that I've seen suggested in places, and I've played with it a little bit to see what it can do, is from a research perspective of taking quotes people have provided and having it code them and provide summaries of data that you've collected. And I've never done it with anything that was stuff I collected through IRB. It was from some other places to see what this would do. But how does that comply with the institutional review board who, approves how you use the data, what you're doing with the data, and so forth? And it opens a can of worms that I'm not sure we've asked all the questions of what are the unintended consequences of the efficiencies you might be able to gain from these new technologies.
And I know review boards are struggling with this right now. And by the way, IRB, as Rob said, it stands for Institutional Review Board, which is what we call in a lot of the U.S., the groups that are responsible for ensuring the safety of human research subjects. Sometimes it's called the Human Use Committee. It goes by different names in different places. But yeah, it's not clear. I mean, for a long time, we've taken things like quotes from interviews and put them into software. But that software then didn't turn around and use it as training data. So it really is different with generative AI. And so I think universities have a lot of work to do around crafting these policies. It gets complicated because you need a set of policies, you need academic administration, there's IT governance that gets involved in all of this. So it's kind of a mess. And we've got a long way to go. But even on the academic side, there are going to be university-level policies, college-level policies, departmental policies, and even course-level policies, not just down to the faculty member, but you might have one class where certain things are acceptable and another class where those same uses of AI are not acceptable. And so what we're going to do is in the next episode, we're going to share one view of how to make this a little bit easier. And I'm going to leave it at that for right now to kind of tease the next episode. But for now, the big message is you need to be working on this, even if you're not. And if you're an individual faculty member or if you're a staff member, if you're not a supervisor, get with your supervisor. If you're a faculty member, you need to have a policy in place for your courses. Even if your university or your college, your department is a little bit slow on the uptake with this, trust me, if you don't have a policy, it's going to come back to bite you. And that's why syllabi are 412 pages long now, because we've got to cover everything. But generative AI is a big one. All right, Rob, any final thoughts on that topic?
Really, policy, I look at in a lot of ways as kind of a CYA approach, right? We want to have it in place so nothing bites us when we didn't intend to be bitten. We've thought about it in advance, and we've taken a fair approach. I think there's the importance of covering your bases by having policy. It protects you from the unintended consequences by thinking about things in advance and being proactive as opposed to being reactive. And I think it's when we get ourselves in trouble is when we're reactive. So I love the idea of being proactive as we step into this world as it is increasingly changing.
And it's a matter of fairness to your students. They don't know what your policy is. How are they going to know if they're violating it? So Rob, offline we were talking about this, and you brought up a really good point that goes beyond the CYA part about the value of a policy. I know nobody wants another policy, but there's a really important benefit to having a clear policy. Tell us about that.
Yeah, what I think is important is the idea of transparency. And if people know what the rules of the road are, they know how to abide by them. But when that's all hidden and made up as we go, or whatever the case may be, then people don't know how to act. People don't know how to behave. But having the transparency that's provided by a policy helps everybody who's engaging in the conversations and the work that needs to be done to know how to approach it and how to do it in a way that's consistent with expectations.
Well, that makes sense to me, yeah. And that's especially important in the classroom.
Hugely.
Like I said, if students cheat and they know they're cheating, that's one thing. But if they cheat and they had no idea they were cheating, that's a different matter.
Yep, that's my fault for having poorly described policies.
Not your fault, but other people's fault, because you'll have a good policy. Okay, I think we're going to call it a day for this episode. For all things AI Goes to College, you can go to aigoestocollege.com. You can follow this podcast by going to aigoestocollege.com/follow, and there's a bunch of links for all different kinds of podcast apps. Just click on it, and it'll let you follow or subscribe or whatever your app calls it. So that's it for this time. We'll talk to you next time. Thank you. Thanks for listening to AI Goes to College. If you found this episode useful, you'll love the AI Goes to College newsletter. Each edition brings you useful tips, news, and insights that you can use to help you figure out what in the world is going on with generative AI and how it's affecting higher ed. Just go to aigoestocollege.com to sign up. I won't try to sell you anything, and I won't spam you or share your information with anybody else. As an incentive for subscribing, I'll send you the Getting Started with Generative AI guide. Even if you're an expert with AI, you'll find the guide useful for helping your less knowledgeable colleagues.